Steve Biko, born December 18, 1946, King Williamstown, South Africa, died September 12, 1977, Pretoria, was the founder of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa. His death from injuries suffered while in police custody made him an international martyr for South African black nationalism. After being expelled from high school for political activism, Biko enrolled in and graduated, 1966, from St. Francis College, a liberal boarding school in Natal, and then entered the University of Natal Medical School. There he became involved in the Multiracial National Union of South African Students, NSAS, a moderate organization that had long espoused the rights of blacks. He soon grew disenchanted with NSAS, believing that, instead of simply allowing blacks to participate in white South African society, the society itself needed to be restructured around the culture of the black majority. In 1968 he co-founded the All-Black South African Students Organization, SASO, and he became its first president the following year. SASO was based on the philosophy of black consciousness, which encouraged blacks to recognize their inherent dignity and self-worth. In the 1970s the black consciousness movement spread from university campuses into urban black communities throughout South Africa. In 1972 Biko was one of the founders of the Black People's Convention, an umbrella organization of black consciousness groups. Biko drew official censure in 1973, when he and other SASO members were banned. Their associations, movements, and public statements were thereby restricted. He then operated covertly, establishing the Zimel Trust Fund in 1975 to help political prisoners and their families. He was arrested 4 times over the next 2 years and was held without trial for months at a time. On August 18, 1977, he and a fellow activist were seized at a roadblock and jailed in Port Elizabeth. Biko was found naked and shackled outside a hospital in Pretoria, 740 miles, 1,190 kilometers, away, on September 11 and died the next day of a massive brain hemorrhage. Police initially denied any maltreatment of Biko. It was determined later that he had probably been severely beaten while in custody, but the officers involved were cleared of wrongdoing. In 1997 5 former police officers confessed to having killed Biko and applied for amnesty to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a body convened to review atrocities committed during the apartheid years. Amnesty was denied in 1999. Donald Woods, a South African journalist, depicts his friendship with Biko in Biko, 1977, 3rd Rev. ed., 1991, and their relationship is portrayed in the film Cry Freedom, 1987. Tall and slim in his youth, by his 20s Biko was over 6 feet tall, with the bulky build of a heavyweight boxer carrying more weight than when in peak condition, according to Woods. His friends regarded him as handsome, fearless, a brilliant thinker. Woods saw him as unusually gifted. His quick brain, superb articulation of ideas and sheer mental force were highly impressive. According to Biko's friend Trudy Thomas, with Biko you had a remarkable sense of being in the presence of a great mind. Woods felt that Biko could enable one to share his vision with an economy of words because he seemed to communicate ideas through extraverbal media, almost psychically. Biko exhibited what Woods referred to as a new style of leadership, never proclaiming himself to be a leader and discouraging any cult of personality from growing up around him. Other activists did regard him as a leader and often deferred to him at meetings. When engaged in conversations, he displayed an interest in listening and often drew out the thoughts of others. The charisma of Steve Biko was entirely his own. He had from an early age the unmistakable bearing and quality of a unique leader. I say unique because his style of leadership was his own. It was unpushy, unpromotional, yet immediately acknowledged by his peers. I was 13 years older than Steve, yet I always had the feeling I was talking to someone older and wiser, and like many others I often sought his advice on all manner of problems. Biko and many others in his activist circle had an antipathy toward luxury items because most South African blacks could not afford them. He owned few clothes and dressed in a low-key manner. He had a large record collection and particularly liked Gumba. He enjoyed parties, and according to his biographer Linda Wilson, he often drank substantial quantities of alcohol. Religion did not play a central role in his life. He was often critical of the established Christian churches, but remained a believer in God and found meaning in the Gospels. Woods described him as not conventionally religious, although he had genuine religious feeling in broad terms. Manco noted that Biko was critical of organized religion and denominationalism and that he was at best an unconventional Christian. The nationalist government portrayed Biko as a hater of whites, but he had several close white friends, and both Woods and Wilson insisted that he was not a racist. Woods related that Biko simply wasn't a hater of people, and that he did not even hate prominent National Party politicians like B.J. Vorster and Andries Treurnicht, instead hating their ideas. It was rare and uncharacteristic of him to display any rage, and was rare for him to tell people about his doubts and inner misgivings, reserving those for a small number of confidants. Biko never addressed questions of gender and sexism in his politics. The sexism was evident in many ways, according to Mamcete Ramphele, a BCM activist and doctor at the Zanempilo Clinic, including that women tended to be given responsibility for the cleaning and catering at functions. There was no way you could think of Steve making a cup of tea or whatever for himself, another activist said. Feminism was viewed as irrelevant bra-burning. Surrounded by women who cared about him, Biko developed a reputation as a womanizer, something that Woods described as well-earned. He displayed no racial prejudice, sleeping with both black and white women. At Nissa's, he and his friends competed to see who could have sex with the most female delegates. Responding to this behavior, the Nissa's General Secretary Sheila Lapinski accused Biko of sexism, to which he responded, "Don't worry about my sexism. What about your white racist friends in Nissa's?" Sabukwi also admonished Biko for his womanizing, believing that it set a bad example to other activists. Biko married Nsiki Mashalaba in December 1970. They had 2 children together, Nkosinathai, born in 1971, and Samora, born in 1975. Biko's wife chose the name Nkosinathai, "The Lord is with us," and Biko named their second child after the Mozambican revolutionary leader Samora Machel. Angered by her husband's serial adultery, Mashalaba ultimately moved out of their home, and by the time of his death, she had begun divorce proceedings. Biko had also begun an extramarital relationship with Mamcete Ramphele. In 1974, they had a daughter, Larido, who died after 2 months. A son, Hlumalo, was born to Ramphele in 1978, after Biko's death. Biko was also in a relationship with Lorraine Tabane. They had a child named Motlatsi in 1977. Biko is viewed as the father of the Black consciousness movement and the anti-apartheid movement's first icon. Nelson Mandela called him the spark that lit a felt fire across South Africa, adding that the nationalist government had to kill him to prolong the life of apartheid. Opening an anthology of his work in 2008, Manning Marable and Penuel Joseph wrote that his death had created a vivid symbol of black resistance to apartheid that continues to inspire new black activists over a decade after the transition to majority rule. Johan de Wet, a professor of communication studies, described him as one of South Africa's most gifted political strategists and communicators. In 2004 he was elected 13th in SABC3's Great South Africans public poll. Although Biko's ideas have not received the same attention as Frantz Fanon's, in 2001 Aluwalia and Mzingaye wrote that the men shared a highly similar pedigree in their interests in the philosophical psychology of consciousness, their desire for a decolonising of the mind, the liberation of Africa, and in the politics of nationalism and socialism for the wretched of the earth. Some academics argue that Biko's thought remains relevant. For example, in African Identities in 2015, Isaac Kamola wrote that Biko's critique of white liberalism was relevant to situations like the United Nations Millennium Development Goals and Invisible Children Incorporated's KONY 2012 campaign. Woods held the view that Biko had filled the vacuum within the country's African nationalist movement that arose in the late 1960s following the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and the banning of Sobukwe. Following Biko's death, the black consciousness movement declined in influence as the ANC emerged as a resurgent force in anti-apartheid politics. This brought about a shift in focus from the BCM's community organizing to wider mass mobilization, including attempts to follow Tambo's call to make South Africa ungovernable, which involved increasing violence and clashes between rival anti-apartheid groups. Followers of Biko's ideas reorganized as the Azanian People's Organization, AZAPO, which subsequently split into the Socialist Party of Azania and the Black People's Convention. Several figures associated with the ANC denigrated Biko during the 1980s. For instance, members of the ANC-affiliated United Democratic Front assembled outside Biko's Ginsberg home shouting "You Steve Biko, ICIA," an allegation that Biko was a spy for the United States Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. These demonstrations resulted in clashes with Biko supporters from AZAPO. A year after Biko's death, his frank talk writings were published as an edited collection, I Write What I Like. The defense that Biko provided for arrested SASO activists was used as the basis for the 1978 book The Testimony of Steve Biko, edited by Millard Arnold. Woods fled to England that year, where he campaigned against apartheid and further publicized Biko's life and death, writing many newspaper articles about him, as well as a book, Biko, 1978. This was made into the 1987 film Cry Freedom by Richard Attenborough, starring Denzel Washington as Biko. Many film critics and black consciousness proponents were concerned that the film foregrounded white characters like Woods over Biko himself, but Cry Freedom brought Biko's life and activism to a wider audience. The state censors initially permitted its release in South Africa, but after it began screening in the country's cinemas, copies were confiscated by police on the order of Police Commissioner General Hendrik de Wit, who claimed that it would inflame tensions and endanger public safety. The South African government banned many books about Biko, including those of Arnold and Woods. Biko was commemorated in several artworks after his death. Gerard Sekoto, a South African artist based in France, produced homage to Steve Biko in 1978, and another South African artist, Peter Stopforth, included a work entitled The Interrogators in his 1979 exhibition. A triptych, it depicted the three police officers implicated in Biko's death. Kenya released a commemorative postage stamp featuring Biko's face. Biko's death also inspired several songs, including from artists outside South Africa such as Tom Paxton and Peter Hamill. The English singer-songwriter Peter Gabriel released Biko in tribute to him, which was a hit single in 1980, and was banned in South Africa soon after. Along with other anti-apartheid music, the song helped to integrate anti-apartheid themes into Western popular culture. Biko's life was also commemorated through theatre. The inquest into his death was dramatized as a play, The Biko Inquest, first performed in London in 1978. A 1984 performance was directed by Albert Finney and broadcast on television. Anti-apartheid activists used Biko's name and memory in their protests. In 1979, a mountaineer climbed the spire of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco to unfurl a banner with the names of Biko and imprisoned Black Panther Party leader Geronimo Pratt on it. Following apartheid's collapse, Woods raised funds to commission a bronze statue of Biko from Naomi Jacobson. It was erected outside the front door of City Hall in East London on the Eastern Cape, opposite a statue commemorating British soldiers killed in the Second Boer War. Over 10,000 people attended the monument's unveiling in September 1997. In the following months it was vandalized several times. In one instance it was daubed with the letters AWB, an acronym of the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, a far-right Afrikaner paramilitary group. In 1997, the cemetery where Biko was buried was renamed the Steve Biko Garden of Remembrance. The District 6 Museum also held an exhibition of artwork marking the 20th anniversary of his death by examining his legacy. Also in September 1997, Biko's family established the Steve Biko Foundation. 266 The Ford Foundation donated money to the group to establish a Steve Biko Center in Ginsberg, opened in 2012. The foundation launched its annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture in 2000, each given by a prominent black intellectual. The first speaker was Njabulo Ndebe, later speakers included Xox Mda, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Mandela. Buildings, institutes and public spaces around the world have been named after Biko, such as the Steve Biko Plein in Amsterdam. In 2008, the Pretoria Academic Hospital was renamed the Steve Biko Hospital. The University of the Witwatersrand has a Steve Biko Center for Bioethics. In Salvador, Bahia, a Steve Biko Institute was established to promote educational attainment among poor Afro-Brazilians. In 2012, the Google Cultural Institute published an online archive containing documents and photographs owned by the Steve Biko Foundation. On December 18, 2016, Google marked what would have been Biko's 70th birthday with a Google Doodle. Amid the dismantling of apartheid in the early 1990s, various political parties competed over Biko's legacy, with several saying they were the party that Biko would support if he were still alive. Azipo in particular claimed exclusive ownership over black consciousness. In 1994, the ANC issued a campaign poster suggesting that Biko had been a member of their party, which was untrue. Following the end of apartheid, when the ANC formed the government, they were accused of appropriating his legacy. In 2002, Azipo issued a statement declaring that Biko was not a neutral, apolitical, and mythical icon, and that the ANC was scandalously using Biko's image to legitimize their weak government. Members of the ANC have also criticized Azipo's attitude to Biko. In 1997, Mandela said that Biko belongs to us all, not just Azipo. On the anniversary of Biko's death in 2015, delegations from both the ANC and the Economic Freedom Fighters independently visited his grave. In March 2017, the South African President Jacob Zuma laid a wreath at Biko's grave to mark Human Rights Day. In the wake of the urban revolt of 1976 and with prospects of a national revolution becoming apparent, security police detained Biko, the outspoken student leader, on August 18, 1977. He was 30 years old and was reportedly extremely fit when arrested. He was detained in Port Elizabeth and on September 11 moved to Pretoria Central Prison, Transvaal, now Gauteng. On September 12, he died in detention, the 20th person to have died in detention in the preceding 18 months. A post-mortem was conducted the day after Biko's death, at which his family was present. The explanation given by the Minister of Justice and Police, Jimmy Kruger, was that Biko died while on a hunger strike. This explanation was not sufficient for observers and people close to Biko. The medical reports received by Minister Kruger were not made public. As Biko was the 20th person to die in police custody, a number of newspapers did their own private investigations and learned that Biko died from brain injuries. Their investigations also revealed that Biko was assaulted before he was transported to Pretoria without any medical attention. 3 South African newspapers carried reports that Biko did not die as a result of a hunger strike. Kruger took one of these papers, the Rand Daily Mail, to the South African Press Council to lodge a complaint after it had published a front-page story claiming that Steve Biko had suffered extensive brain damage. The Star, another daily press, came out in support of the Rand Daily Mail and pointed out that newspapers would continue to write about the circumstances surrounding Biko's death because the police were found to be responsible. The World and Weekend World newspapers also continued to cover reports about the death of Biko. The 2 newspapers augmented earlier reports by pointing out that Biko was not the first person to die while in detention. Moreover, all these deaths happened under mysterious circumstances. In addition, the Johannesburg Sunday Express said that sources connected with the forensic investigation maintained that brain damage had been the cause of death. In Britain, it was learned from South African sources that fluid drawn from the victim's spine revealed many red cells, an indication of brain damage. A photograph of Biko lying in his coffin was taken secretly just before the funeral, and sent by an underground South African source to Britain. This was seen as added proof that the anti-apartheid student activist had been beaten to death while in prison. Kruger claimed that he had never fired any police officer for brutality or any related misconduct, and he strenuously denied the beating of Biko in an interview with the American Time magazine. Biko's brutal death made him a martyr in the history of black resistance to white hegemony. It inflamed black anger and inspired a rededication to the struggle for freedom. Progressive Federal Party parliamentarian, Helen Suzman, warned Minister of Justice, Jimmy Kruger, that the world was not going to forget the Biko affair, adding, "We will not forget it either." Kruger's reply that Biko's death left him cold, echoed around the world. A widespread crackdown on black student organizations and political movements followed. Just before the Biko and deaths in detention inquest, police honed in on the remaining black consciousness resistance organizations. In the process, two of Biko's white friends, the Reverend Bayers Node and Donald Woods, were banned, and Percy Kobaza, editor of The World, was banned for allegedly writing exaggerated articles about the manner of Biko's death. Prime Minister Vorster then called an election, and a large majority of white voters called for Vorster's nationalist government to remain in power to face the formidable challenge of a distinctly polarized black population. An international outcry, and condemnation of South Africa's security laws led directly to the West's decision to support the United Nations, UN, Security Council vote to ban mandatory arms sales to South Africa, Resolution 418 of November 4, 1977. The South African problem had been on the international agenda almost from the start of the United Nations, and was acknowledged as an international problem by the Western powers after Sharpeville in 1960. It was also kept on the agenda through sustained Afro-Asian diplomatic efforts that were conducted under the auspices of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM. Institutional pressure on the Western powers to do something about South Africa was intensified after the Soweto riots in 1976, particularly following the death of Steve Biko in police custody. These events led to a new round of Security Council meetings and a mandatory arms embargo, the first time that action had been taken against South Africa under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Codes of conduct for Western businesses operating in South Africa were also introduced, due to a newspaper campaign in Britain that accused Western businesses of profiting from apartheid by paying their workers below subsistence wages. In South Africa, urban conditions for blacks continued to deteriorate, as large numbers of impoverished Bantustan inhabitants, now ignored by the labor recruiters, bypassed influx control mechanisms in their search for employment. Consequently, informal settlements outside the cities became overcrowded as the state halted the provision of new urban housing. Transport also deteriorated and discontent mounted among both workers and the unemployed. At the same time, the relative success of the workers' strikes and other institutional shortcomings inspired the Black consciousness movement. The United States Congress also called for a probe into Biko's death. The Congress sent a letter of request to the South African ambassador, Donald B. Soule, in the USA. The letter requested that an international panel of experts be established to investigate the death of Biko. The letter's demands were not limited to Biko's death, as it also requested an investigation of South Africa's detention practices. Moreover, the letter stated that the death of Biko highlighted South Africa's human rights record and would add to the country's further isolation. SASO, the South African Students' Movement, SASM, and the Soweto Students' Representative Council, SSRC, were defunct by the end of 1977. The principal leaders were either in jail, in exile, or dead. The establishment of new movements drawing on the experiences of 1976 was needed, with the immediate task of constructing a new unified ideology. Although many people were still nervous about political activity following the 1977 crackdown on BC organizations, the Azanian People's Organization, AZAPO, was formed in 1978 as a successor to the proscribed black consciousness structures. It was an attempt at further espousing and reinventing the black consciousness philosophy, which Biko bequeathed to South Africa. It launched a student wing, the Azanian Students' Organization, AZASO, made up of university students. AZAPO and AZASO therefore filled the organizational vacuum in the townships created by the banning of the ANC, POC, and the BCM. At this stage, no obvious conflict between the new groups and the ANC tradition existed. Thank you for watching this video.